Welcome to another Richmond Center Public Lecture Series event at Columbia. Thank you all for being here. I'm Jesse Green, Senior Fellow at the Center. The Richmond Center is a joint venture of Columbia Law School and Columbia Business School. Tonight we have another in the series of topics that are the focus of the Richmond Center, topics where the markets intersect with the law. Over the past few years, we've brought important topics and outstanding speakers from across the business spectrum to the Columbia campus, the students, and the faculty. Tonight, we have another outstanding panel of business leaders for all of you to hear from and interact with. The discussion tonight, Seizing Tomorrow's Global Market Opportunities, is the result of the leadership of Sam Palmisano, co-founder and chairman of the Center for Global Enterprise and retired chairman, CEO, and president of IBM, a truly global enterprise. CGE and the Richmond Center have been working together in a number of areas, and this event is a continuation of that developing relationship. This event is being webcast, and the audience can follow, participate, or ask questions anytime during the program via live tweets from the Twitter handle that you see on the screen behind us here, on the slide behind the panel. Video highlights and the full webcast will be on the CGE website after the event. To moderate tonight's event is international best-selling author Tom Friedman. As you all know, Tom is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a columnist at the New York Times. We are pleased to have his participation, his broad perspective and leadership thinking with us tonight. Let me introduce the panel before we get started here. First is Shelley Lazarus, former chairman and CEO of Ogilvy and Mather. Next to her is Christopher Kane, president and co-founder of CGE and CEO of Mercator XXL, formerly vice president of global government programs at IBM. Next to him is Doug Haynes, president of Point 72 Asset Management and formerly a director at McKinsey. We also have two students here with us tonight. We had an interesting process. We invited students to participate in this event, and we had an essay contest. Students wrote essays, and the two you have before you were selected to be on this panel and to engage with these issues. Ji Gu is a second-year MBA student here at Columbia Business School. She has worked for 7 years for Lloyd's Banking Group in London, where she managed savings and investment products, pricing strategies, and led a trade and supply chain finance team. Her essay focused on rising share of non-working adults and the rapid change of organizational culture. Next to G is Grant Van Wyangarden. I hope I pronounced that correct. Good. He's a first-year MBA student here at Columbia. Prior to attending Columbia, he advised multinational corporations and governments as a management consultant in Australia, Canada, Ghana, and developing countries in Southeast Asia. His essay focused on the rise of distributed renewable energy and the contribution that it will have on the growth of disrupting technologies in emerging markets. So after Grant, we have David Kapos, who may or may not be able to make it tonight. I hope he will. David is a partner at Cravath, and he was Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the U.S. Patent Office from 2009 to 2013. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Tom Friedman to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jesse. And it's a treat to be here and be part of this panel and this discussion. It's near and dear to my heart. And when Sam asked me to come, we'd stolen a lot of horses together over the years, and so I couldn't resist to be part of this opportunity and this great book. This is about their book, but I'll take just a couple minutes to frame this moment as I see it, because I'm actually working on a book of my own, which is a kind of continuation of The World is Flat. I think we're at a remarkable inflection point. I think we're at a Gutenberg scale inflection point, and it really frames growing global. Someone was alive, when Gutenberg invented the printing press. And some monk said to some priest, that's really cool. You mean we don't have to write all this Bibles out longhand anymore? We can just stamp them out? Now that is really cool. And I think you're alive at a similar inflection point. In fact, you were alive when on February 4th, 2011, on, of all places, a game show called Jeopardy. There were 3 contestants. One's name was Ken Jennings, all-time Jeopardy champion. Second's name was Brad Rutter, second all-time Jeopardy champion. And the third contestant simply went by his, or was it her, last name, Watson. Watson passed on the first question. And on the second question, buzzed in under 2.5 seconds. And the question was, worn on the foot of a horse and used by a dealer in a casino. And in under 2.5 seconds, Watson answered in Jeopardy style, what is shoe? And I would posit that the world hasn't been the same since. That what is shoe actually should go down in history with Mr. Watson, please come here, uttered by Alexander Graham Bell to Thomas Watson. As a fundamental inflection point, a computer answered a pun, figured out a pun, posed in natural language, and answered in natural language. So where are we? What's going on? What defines this inflection point? Well, I've kind of known something was up because I wrote The World is Flat. I started it in 2004. And wrote another book, came out in 2005. I wrote another book in 2011. The World is Flat argued that the world was getting connected in a way that was allowing more people in more places to compete, connect, and collaborate globally than ever before. In 2011, I sat down to write another book 7 years later. It's called That Used to Be Us, about America. And the first thing I did when I sat down to write this new book was I got the first edition of The World is Flat off my bookshelf just to remind myself what I wrote. I opened it to the index, and I looked under A, B, C, D, E, F, F, A, C, E, B, O, O. Facebook wasn't in it. Yeah, when I was running around the world in 2004 telling people the world is flat, we are all connected. Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was still a sound. The cloud was still in the sky. 4G was a parking place. LinkedIn was a prison. Applications what you sent to college. Big data was a rap star. And Skype was a typographical error. All of that happened in 7 years. All of that happened in 7 years. And most of it happened, for those of you who are wine aficionados, there are vintage years in wine, and there are vintage years in history. And 2007 was a vintage year. Because in 2007, the iPhone came out, GitHub started, Hadoop started, Android came out. I can go down the list. A lot of freaky stuff happened in 2007, and we were all distracted by the subprime crisis. But in fact, something really, really big was happening. And I would argue that what was happening was that, for me, The World is Flat was about a moment when connectivity became fast, free, easy for you, and ubiquitous. And what happened 7 years later is that complexity became fast, free, easy for you, and invisible. And those things together have created a pivot point that is changing everything. When connectivity became fast, free, easy for you, and invisible, we all woke up one day and discovered we were being touched by people who never touched us before. And we could touch people who we could never touch before. And when 7 years later complexity became fast, free, easy for you, and invisible, it was all about what we could do with one touch. Remember what it was like to catch a cab 4 years ago? Okay? Now all that complexity has been abstracted into one touch. And what's going on now is we are inside an engine that is abstracting more and more complexity in more and more ways, in more and more days, in more and more places, and more industries. And when you enter a world of who you can touch with one touch and the complexity that can be abstracted in one touch, you are in a really fast world where growing global becomes an incredible opportunity and an incredible challenge. And with that, Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Tom, thank you, my friend. We've spent a lot of time together, as you'll hear when I start talking, mostly on the golf course, but we'll leave that for later. Pretty good places. No, but anyway, one of the things as Tom articulated that, it was about the same time that I was transitioning out of IBM, because my last year as CEO was 2011, so that was the Watson, Jeopardy show was February that year. And when I was departing, I came to this conclusion based on a lot of what Tom was saying, that young people aren't being prepared for the world that they're now going to engage in. I had a personal opinion, a belief that was the case. I was able to convince some of my colleagues up here that was the case, and that we should try to help and as best we can, so we formed this thing called the Center for Global Enterprises, because it's about business on a global scale, and then how could we advance the learning. If you go back to Tom's dimension, he took you through the technology dimension of the early part of the 21st century, but if you put on top of that a macroeconomic dimension, where you had countries, emerging countries, who were growing very rapidly at that point in time, primarily because if they stopped warring or having coups or revolutions and decided that regardless of their structure, whether it's democratic or socialist or capitalist or whatever, to engage the global economy, that they could grow very, very rapidly. And that this technology, this ubiquitous way to interface, and at that point in time, quite honestly, as you were in the early 2000s, you were talking about standards of the internet exchange of documents. Word, from a Microsoft perspective, was pretty much ubiquitous in the world, and governments would argue it was monopoly, but what have you, was pretty much the platform at that point in time, so all these things could occur. So you had this rapid growth in the emerging markets. The developed world was, slower, but still growing, not like it is today. So that was kind of the environment. But then we saw these things occurring, and that's the environment where we wrote the first book. And that was, we wrote the book about Rethink, because we're saying if the world's globalizing and interconnecting economically, and that therefore these technology platforms are going to allow you to participate in that growth without having physical presence everywhere, you should rethink the structure of a corporation. And it was really looking back in some ways and then looking slightly to the future, but not dramatically to the future. Then take that and put on top of that Tom's point of view on technology, which would have been now 07, and throw on top of that a macroeconomic environment that has, on a good day, is slow growth. I mean, that's a positive outlook on a good day, right? And then throw in there some geopolitical disruptions that not referring to Brussels this morning, but they're like almost routine. I mean, the stock market didn't crash today. I mean, it says something about what's happening, that we just absorb these things now, and people don't find them to be massively, other than the airline industry, let's say, or tourism, it wasn't a massive disruption. In fact, I think healthcare was the sector that lifted the market today, not technology. But nonetheless, I mean, this is where we find ourselves today. So we thought that it was time to go take a future look. So many of my co-authors are with me today, is take this look as to where we're going next. Let's project this out in time, take Tom's observations and protect the impact to the business, the corporation, and some of the key processes of a corporation. It's marketing, it's market access, intellectual property, culture, management systems, innovation. These are the chapters of the book. The platform-based business models are in there as well, and then project out their implications from a corporate perspective. And what we're trying to do at the center, in addition to release this new book, is actually create a learning environment, which is what we're collaborating with Jesse on in the Richmond Center with a lot of other schools around the world. And I think the easiest way to think about it is we have a research agenda now that's studying 4 different key areas from a research perspective. But the more important thing is we've actually launched a Global Scholars Program where people can get learning online. It's all for free. We're a nonprofit, so you don't have to your parents don't have to spend $75,000 a year to go to the wonderful business school. I think at least that's what it was when my son went here. It's probably gone up since then. But nonetheless, you don't have that kind of expense. But it's learning, but it's addressing learning where there are gaps. So what we're trying to provide to future leaders are where we find gaps that need to be addressed in some way. And we can talk about the gaps, but it's the combination of the factors that Tom and I are talking about that leads to a rethinking of the corporate structure, a rethinking of management capabilities, a rethinking of leadership skills, all the things you all need to be successful as you go forward. So that's the point. So we have a scholars program. The scholars participate in studies for companies. One we just most recently did was, you'll enjoy this one, Tom, the London Taxi Company. We did a study for the London Taxi Company in the impact of ride sharing. That is Uber or Lyft. But if you were running the London Taxi, black cabs in London, how would you perceive this? How would you look at your business model? How would technology have an effect from that dimension? So that's the center. That's why we wrote the second book. And one of the best chapters in the entire book was written by my old friend and colleague Shelley on how do you create a global brand.
So people are fascinated by brands. Just that's the first thing. And I am a proselytizer because I do believe that a brand is the most important asset that any organization has, and that brands, when they're well understood, they become these powerful organizing principles for everything you do as an organization. What strikes me in listening to you is when I've been working in global brands, with global brands, my whole career. What that meant when I started out was that Unilever would have a product called Dove, and then they would say, this is a good idea, it's selling well, why don't we move it to the UK? And they'd move it to 2 or 3 places, and we would all learn from each other, and then you'd have something that was a little more global, like American Express, and they would say, well, we need a global brand, and we need to put it in every place in the world because we have some people who actually go from place to place, and there has to be a consistency for that brand as they travel. And now we're in a world where everybody's connected all the time and there's only a single brand, and the question then becomes, it's now become not only a necessity, but it's a driver of business. Because once you figure it out in one place, you can figure it out in 200 places at one time. And so the power of it is enormous. The question is, how do you do it? Because it actually is very tricky. And the first question you have to answer is it possible to have a truly global brand? When people stand up and go, no, different cultures, there are different languages, there are different ways people express themselves, there are different relationships between people. And the answer is yes, it is indeed possible. You must actually, I would argue, have a global brand, but you have to be able to know what's at the core of the brand. What is universal? What is it that you will find wherever you meet that brand anywhere in the world? And then figure out how to interpret the universal for the particular geography. And that's the art of it. So American Express is American Express is American Express. The way it's expressed in China is probably going to be different from the way it's expressed in the United States. And you have to figure that out. The second point I would make is there is a spectrum, there's a continuum of how centralized or decentralized you want your brand to be. And you have to decide, there's no right or wrong answer, it's a long line, but you have to decide how you're going to manage your brand globally, where you want to be. There are companies that say, we will deliver the orders from headquarters and you will do exactly what we say in exactly the right colors with exactly the right tonality everywhere in the world. And there are other companies that say, here are some basic principles. Now we free you to express those principles in the most relevant way you can locally. It doesn't matter where you are in the spectrum. What matters is that everyone understands and buys in to the way you're going to manage the brand. And that makes a huge difference to whether you do it successfully or not. But all brands today have to be global because the world is global. And I could go on for hours, but I won't. I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Shelley. So I had the opportunity and the responsibility of writing the chapter about government, and the chapter is called "A Market Force Like No Others." It really discusses the interdependence between business and government, which is very strong and only getting stronger. We look at the three roles of any type of government, whether it's a democracy, whether it's a parliamentary system, whether it's a communist system. All governments around the world do the same three things. They all are rule makers. They all set the rules for society and the economy. They're all investors, and they're all purchasers. And as a business operating globally, where you're naturally going to be executing your business plan across cultures and across borders, your ability to understand the commonalities of government and where government intersects with a market positively or negatively is really important to your ability to leverage growth as well as your ability to mitigate risk. So we then go on in the chapter to talk about these behaviors of government, these responsibilities of government happening in an era of pervasive and evolving digital domain, as Tom was referencing a couple minutes ago, and an environment of a closing door on economic openness, which is very different from 10 years ago or 15 years ago. When Tom wrote the book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, or The World is Flat, there was a consensus among the world governments that economic openness was a good thing, that you would win more by being open and integrated with the rest of the world than you would lose by being open and integrated. There has actually been a retreat from that belief. There are lots of reasons for that, and maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. So part of the chapter looks at this role of government, its interdependence with business, and the implications for that at a time of a retreat from economic openness. And yet this is happening exactly at the same time that we were just talking about, that Sam was referring to, which is a time of accelerated information and data integration. So on the one hand, you have behavior stepping back from integration and openness, and yet you have reality stepping forward at a very high rate of speed. Also in the chapter, we talk about government and a demand-side economy. We live in a demand-side economy today. Most of us grew up in a supply-side economy, where we had an idea to make a product or deliver a service, and we got it when we wanted to give it to you. That's been turned on its head, and your generation is benefiting from the fact that you have lots of choices, and you can exercise those choices pretty much when and if you want. Now that flips the idea of a corporation on its head. You have to therefore understand that you are now obligated to respond to the customer in ways that are pretty new. All right, and let me talk about that. New in the sense that there is the power and the impact of transparency. We were just discussing that a little bit. It creates accountability 24/7. With transparency comes tremendous opportunity. It also comes tremendous risk. And therefore, to Shelley's point, if you don't know what your brand is, or if you don't construct what you want your brand to be, you will constantly be held accountable on the negative side of performance. Yet if you do know what your brand stands for and your company stands for, transparency can be a tremendously powerful leverage point. But it's very different than the world of supply-side economics that we grew up in. And then we close the chapter by talking about assessing the management impacts of an environment of velocity. And Tom mentioned that, and maybe that's where his book is going. But for government, that's not easy. All right, the management implications for government, generally speaking, are pretty tricky and not very successful. The management implications for government in an environment of velocity are going to be even more challenging. So that's what the chapter wraps up with. So now, Doug.
Terrific. And that's where culture comes in. No matter what Chris ended on, I was going to say, and that's where culture comes in. I had the privilege of writing the chapter on culture, and it's written as sort of a how-to for leaders of global enterprises, but it really covers three main topics. The first, I take a position on what culture is. I make an effort to define culture. And in doing so, I say that culture is the thing in any institution. By the way, that institution could be an enterprise, it could be a school, it could be a country. It's the thing that binds all the stakeholders together. The beliefs, the values, the practices, the norms, the stories that we share, the history that we share, the glue that pulls everybody together. And in the case of an enterprise, that's employees, leaders, suppliers, customers, the communities in which the enterprise operates. The second point of the chapter is that leaders can shape culture and leaders can design culture. And I go a little bit further and say it's not only an opportunity of leadership to do so, but an obligation of leadership to do so. And I make the point that if you look to any organization and you see the things you like about the culture, you see the things you don't like about the culture, they will always be reflected in the leader, because the leader is not only the de facto designer of the culture, but they're also, they give authenticity to the culture by their actions and whether or not and how they live it. And then the final piece of the chapter looks forward and says, how will this change over the next several years? And the case that I make is that with increased choice, increased freedom, increased transparency on the part of all the stakeholders in any institution, that culture becomes even more important. I wrote that chapter, at least did the first draft of that chapter, about a year ago. I would have to say that the intervening 12 months have made me feel more strongly about most points in the chapter, but none more so than this last point. And I've been asked a lot of questions about the chapter, and probably the most pointed lately was, what did I think of the U.S. presidential election in the context of culture? And my response was, well, it's pretty interesting that we've gotten this far in the primary process without actually discussing policy at all, and that probably tells you that this election is entirely about culture. And then all you have to do is watch a debate, watch one of the rallies, and you can see that that's the case. So people are making very clear choices about perhaps the most important thing that we can decide almost entirely about culture. And that translates to, not only countries, enterprises, individuals, schools, and other institutions. So with that, I'll pass it to Dave Campos.
Okay, thanks, Doug. And that's where the legal system comes in. Tying everything together that you've heard. So the legal system and intellectual property in specific, which is what my chapter is about, is the currency of innovation that enables commerce to move in this globalized environment that we're talking about. And in part in the chapter, we looked at 6 megatrends that are shaping the intellectual property system in this new globalized environment that will resonate, I'm sure, with most everyone here. Megatrend number 1, changing access and consumption patterns. You don't consume content anywhere near the way the previous generation did. Songs are consumed, music is consumed very differently online now than it was in the past. Distribution patterns in that context are becoming instantaneous and ubiquitous. So those are major changes that shape access and consumption patterns. Megatrend number 2, new technologies that are making copying much, much easier than for any previous generation, right? Whether you're talking about software, which is all about copying many different media very, very quickly and easily, whether you're talking about the implications of 3D printing, talking about copying in many good ways, but also some not so good ways, becoming very, very easy to do. And as there is more stress on the mechanisms of our society, and that's the legal system, that is about incenting people who do things that others want to copy, whether it's software designers and developers, or artists, or songwriters, or musicians, or inventors, or whatever. And it's the legal system that then has to step in and deal with that and provide the right balance between incentives on a global basis and use rights on a global basis. And as a megatrend, we are clearly struggling with that these days in the legal system. Megatrend number 3, increased user involvement in creating the products and services that we all love these days. So look at phenomena like Wikipedia, 100,000 or more people contributing to putting together a product or a service, and that's just one of many examples. In a world in which there's so much user involvement in running any business, whether it's a business like IBM having to become extremely inviting to and collaborative with its users, you're talking about a world in which new licensing options, new engagement options are absolutely essential on a national and a global basis in order to engage with constituencies, the public, your customers, third parties, whatever it is, innovators coming in this environment, having such easy access between users and companies or groups that they're interacting with. Megatrend number 4, shifting business models. So distributors are taking advantage of much lower marginal costs of production these days. We see that in business models just collapsing before our eyes while other business models rise up so quickly. Consumers are showing preferences, like probably most people in this room are showing preferences for use models of access and consumption rather than ownership models. That's the way we consume music nowadays on Spotify. It's the way we get to and fro using Lyft and Uber as opposed to owning automobiles that we all did in previous generations. And major legal shifts just starting to catch up and come to cope with that major shift. Megatrend number 5, the global market for products and services. It used to be even one generation ago, you thought of creating a product and service, you did it in your home country. Shelley was saying before, in your brand here, you take a long time to grow. Now, your product, once you put it out, is inherently global in nature, and you will be getting calls or complaints or what have you, offers and issues coming up very, very quickly on a global basis. In that context, there are many more product choices, and that's a good thing, but there's again more stress on a legal system that's not really made in a global environment to deal with global commerce. And then the last megatrend is fragmentation of intellectual property ownership. So just like real property over time tends to become fragmented with people selling off large chunks of land and becoming smaller chunks of land and smaller, similarly with intellectual property. And we're seeing that phenomenon in rights becoming split between many more parties. You have mashups, you have sampling, you have excerpting, you have repurposing. All of those are great. They create more fragmentation of the rights system and therefore more challenges and new practices, new laws, and new interpretations needed in order to be able to have a globally efficient commercial system working in that context.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just follow up with a couple questions here. Sam, you left your post running IBM in 2011? So 5 years ago, roughly. If you were parachuted back in the job today, how different would the company be from when you just left 5 years ago? The company, the markets, and the challenges.
Well, let me start with I'll start with the markets, right, have changed, I mean, so dramatically. I think I used the expression, it's technology on steroids. And I agree with you that Watson was a watershed event. I don't think people realized it at that point in time because they thought it was a game show. but it was much more than a game show. Obviously, you can now embed intelligence in almost every decision point, every business process. You can apply analytics to skills development and hiring. You can apply analytics to diagnostic systems in healthcare. You can have experts advise you to help you cure rare diseases where you probably don't practice that every day. Everything in life is going to be touched by intelligence, not just your ability to get a ride in 2 minutes when you're paying your bill in a restaurant. So it's a huge shift. And the challenge of that shift is if you had a macroeconomic environment of, say, 4 to 5% global GDP, or say 3 to 4, not 1 to 2, a lot of the issues that you see this retrenchment that are occurring from a public perspective, from governments, is because of not everyone's participating in the change. So if everyone was participating in this phenomenal shift, other than the companies who are positioned in the right place, or the elements of society who have the analytical skills, or are fortunate enough to go to Columbia or CBS or Columbia Law School, what have you, right, then there wouldn't be this other issue that we're wrestling with. But you combine those two, then make yourself a business. So you make yourself a business where you have to adapt to this massive technology shift. Of course, companies like IBM can drive that through cognitive computing and those kinds of things. Other companies are going to have to deal with that. What does it mean? It's not that ride sharing, people are getting taxis, I should ignore Uber. No, it's a platform business model, and you can't ignore a platform business model. I mean, think about it today, weather. It's not, you're no longer getting the weather, you're getting traffic patterns, you're getting directions, because it's a platform, and then therefore it'll broaden its user base. You can sell advertising, you can sell product, you can sell umbrellas, raincoats, whatever it happens to be, all for these platform-based business models. So there's a dramatic effect associated with that. So, and then the last dimension is, as Chris was alluding to, government now wants to have a much more involved role. I mean, you see it in privacy and you see it in security of data and information over the internet. And unless those problems are addressed, that is their responsibility to have a more involved role. So the net of all this is, for you guys, it's a really, really tough world out there. And I think I'm not to give a commercial for what we're trying to do in the nonprofit side of it, but I believe that what you're being trained in a lot of these professional schools is not enough to get you ready for what I just said. It's not enough. And the fact that you know how to use a cell phone doesn't make you a data scientist to figure out how to do real-time pricing when Amazon just dropped in your jet. And think about that, right? Because you can do one click, didn't prepare you to write that algorithm that surfed everything on the web for that pricing changed, and Amazon went, and 3 seconds later you went below them. All done digitally. Or all of a sudden you're practicing medicine and you were trained on traditional methods of medicine, right? But now you can literally yell into a phone, get an expert called Watson, and Watson tell you the highest odds procedure or test you should run given that case and that patient's genomic makeup. So it's a completely different world, Tom. So I think it's just extremely challenging. Now with that, tremendous opportunities. I mean, they're just tremendous opportunities to participate in all those opportunities. Wherever you are in the world, you're no longer restricted that you had to be part of the G20 to participate in that.
You listening to you, Sam, it reinforces for me that one of the terms that I've started to ban the use of is the term the cloud. Because it sounds so soft, sounds so fluffy, so benign. Sounds like a Joni Mitchell song. I've looked at clouds from... This ain't no cloud. Okay, this is a supernova. Right. This is the explosion of a star, which is the greatest source of energy in nature, only it's an ever-accelerating supernova. And Chris, therefore, when fast is really fast, slow is really slow. And so this mismatch between technology operating at the pace of a supernova now, get cloud out of your head, and government, just by nature, by the nature of the beast being slow, and then you have our government, which is has made itself structurally stupid by the process of gerrymandering of political districts, money in politics, and my business, the media, so that we're at a stage now where we had something this last year which was remarkable. I'm not picking on one party or another, but Richard Shelby, who chaired basically the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, simply refused to hold any hearings because he was going to be required to approve judges appointed by Barack Obama, and he was in a primary race, and he felt that would be used by his primary opponents to brand him as a liberal if he simply did his job. So we went for a year and a half without the committee meeting. And in a world that Sam's just described as he left his job 5 years ago and we barely recognize the company today, are we roadkill? Who's we? You talking to me? I mean, what's a country to do?
Sure. So I think I like to break this down into a couple of different ways. One, there's the process by which government gets instilled. That's called politics, okay? And there's the process by which government is supposed to manage the affairs of day-to-day life in the state, right? And that's called governance. Then there's accountability, which is supposed to apply to both sides of that equation.
It's a good way to do it, yeah.
And accountability is revealing stresses in both governance and politics.
What do you mean by that?
In the sense that since everything is transparent, the political behavior that you've just cited a number of decades ago would have been expected because they had distance from being held accountable and visible to all of us. But now, if a politician decides not to hold hearings, that's known instantaneously, which also creates the opportunity not just for a feedback loop, but for an engagement loop. You can now assert your claim of complaint to your government, at least in our country, and say that that is an irresponsible act, right, by that member of Congress. That wasn't possible decades before. And while it's possible now, I think we're living in an experimental phase as to whether people care. And that gets to accountability. And it gets to a period where people say, well, you know what, I don't really trust my government. And if you look at how people feel about all institutions across almost all societies, trust is down across all institutions compared to 20 years ago, compared to 40 years ago.
Radically down in our government. I think that's related to the rise of Trump.
So therefore, you end up with, where do people go to seek trusted advice?
Yeah.
And that's a long story, but in the process of governing, there were rules that were set up and structures that were set up for the industrial age where information came top down. We are now in the information age where information goes organically bottoms up. The mere structure of government on the governing side is so antiquated and out of touch that it couldn't succeed even if it moved faster.
Anybody got any drugs? This is like, just, wow. This is like, yeah, it's, don't tweet that was a joke. Shelley, what does Twitter mean to the world of branding? Because I can now brand somebody much faster than you can.
So what it means is that everybody has a voice and everybody knows everything, everywhere, immediately. It's it really means that you have to be in the conversation constantly because it's going on around you whether you're in it or not. And I think one of the changes that I've seen is sort of especially big companies at the start of the age of social media, they just kind of wanted it to go away. Like, I don't want to talk to those people because they're going to talk back and then I'm going to have to talk to them. It's going to be my full-time job. It's, well, you know, you don't have a choice anymore. And it's, I mean, I just came from a global company that is just launching 7 social media centers around the world that will be staffed 24/7 by, as they said, no one over the age of 25 will be in them, but they will be in constant conversation and then aggregating all the comments that are coming in from all over the world, assessing them in real time, and then figuring out what the message is going to be. And if you're not going to play that game, you're not going to be a successful global company.
Well, Doug, let's go back to the government question just for a second. Because I was reading the chapter by Michael Spence and Kevin Warsh, you know.
Yeah.
And really what I took away from that chapter is something very sobering. And it was alluded to here that this terrible combination of a world of technology and business that is accelerating at an ever greater velocity, and a economy that is really growing very sluggishly. And that's it's such a disruptive, it has a lot of people unmoored, because as Sam said, if we were growing at 4%, okay, I can deal with the change, but if my income is flat, and I'm being replaced by a robot, that's a whole different world. To what extent is the fact that we basically have not had any fiscal policy of any real design? I mean, not something cobbled together at 5 to midnight with no due diligence. I mean, real fiscal policy. Since when? I forget. Yeah, no, really.
Well, I was also going to comment that you know, from the asset management world, we haven't had much in the way of monetary policy
Yeah.
for the last 8 years either.
We did at least have a monetary policy. You could agree with it or disagree
Right,
with
right.
it. But you know, you did have QE. I mean, and you felt that on the fiscal side. So all this is changing, and there was no one sort of.
Right. No, my argument about monetary policy is that we thought that QE and zero interest rates were good under these economic conditions, but now we say, well, it's good under these economic conditions too, and those economic conditions, and there's pretty much no economic conditions where we don't think it's good now.
Yeah.
Which that doesn't really count as policy.
But in the absence of fiscal policy, that's what you got.
Well, let me
yeah.
give you a cultural comment on that, because I was thinking about I was thinking about culture when Chris was answering. About 10 years ago, maybe more, Tom Peters wrote that technology's next target was the white-collar employee, was the white-collar worker. It's been quite a while that he wrote this, and he said that, you know, it seems implausible, right, because we look at college-educated or highly educated or even highly trained people in the workforce, and we say they just do things machines can't possibly do. And he said, but machines will be able to do it, and when this gets going, look out, right? This was many, many years ago. And there's a lot of evidence that he was right. And that we're now in the lookout. We're now in the lookout part of that phenomenon. Right? This is a word I was searching for. What does that mean? That means that a lot of people who didn't imagine that they would have trouble being employed, staying employed, getting a wage increase based on investments they had made in education or training or years of experience are now suddenly sounding like the auto workers of the 1970s. Now, why does this connect to culture? The response, the cultural response, and cultures can be, I make the distinction not in the book, but in a couple of speaking engagements I've done since, which is, don't think of culture as good or bad. Cultures are strong or weak and functional or dysfunctional. And it's possible for a culture to be strong and dysfunctional, right? This is where government comes in. One of the things we're seeing in this election is many candidates, and it's very tempting to think that I'm talking about one candidate, many candidates are taking that unsettled feeling that people have that technology is upsetting the deal that I thought I signed up for when I launched my career, or made certain decisions, or embarked on a certain path, that deal got changed, and I didn't expect that deal to get changed. Many people are looking at that and saying, this is somebody's fault, right? I need a person to blame. And a lot of candidates are, remember what I said earlier, is that the head of any institution or enterprise is the de facto leader of the culture. A lot of them are promoting a culture of, this is whose fault it is. If you elect me, we'll go get them, right? And that leads to a strong and dysfunctional culture.
Tom,
Please, yeah,
I went to you and I were at a luncheon together in August of 2007 in my conference room, and there were two economists there, one from Cambridge, Carlotta Perez, and one from Cal Berkeley, Dr. Weber. And we sat there, and you and I were the lay people in the dialogue, and they made a comment that basically inexpensive money has led to too much risk in the economy, and there's not enough capital flow to the production, innovation, manufacturing side of the economy. It's too much in the financial sector, which they refer to, not us, as gambling. And that most of the economic growth is driven off of gambling, and there's too much leverage, and this is going to have a really unhappy ending. This is August, mid-August, second week of August 2007, and literally 1 year later, and 1 year and 3 months, Lehman Brothers goes out of business. So, go back to where we are today. Kevin Warsh and Dean Hubbard of this wonderful school, Glenn Hubbard, wrote a paper. And they wrote a paper which nobody read because of the political process is driven off of culture or personality versus substance. But their paper was not really written for any particular candidate. Some candidates picked it up, but it wasn't written as a policy paper for a candidate. It basically makes the argument today that says if you want the economy, Michael Spence was not part of it, but he would espouse this. If you want the economy today to grow at 3.5 to 4, you need to address the fundamental issue of capital flows. And let's think, we had a crisis in 2008, and what has changed in capital flows? Nothing, right? Nothing. Leverage is down. That's about it. So,
what does that mean? Be a little more specific, Sam. What does it mean, change the direction of capital flows or the scope of
So
capital?
if you were a government and you wanted to change capital flows, you would touch the incentive system, right? That's something called tax.
Right.
So right now there are incentives in the tax system to continue to invest in financial instruments, i.e. carry forward interest, capital gains, housing. Well, there's the crisis. So nothing's changed. I mean, individual rates have gone up, but nothing that would get capital to flow into R&D, innovation,
That's right.
future manufacturing investment. That's called capital investment, not money into some instrument that they made up the night before and used a smart computer like Watson to trade it every day. So that's fundamentally...
Let me pick up on that. That's a very interesting point, and it answers the question that was on my mind, but I want to ask both Doug and Dave this, because you both touch on this. I'm thinking of starting a new party, and I call my...
I have the money. I'm serious, don't kid.
So I am...
we got $2 billion. I got $2 billion, buddy, so go ahead. Keep going.
I am a nonpartisan extremist, okay? And that's how I identify myself. I'm not a centrist. I'm not some mush between two clearly defined positions. And so I'm actually to the left of Bernie Sanders and to the right of the Wall Street Journal editorial page at the same time. And by the way, I'm dead serious about this, okay? I think in this world we're going into of accelerations, we're going to need much more serious social safety nets. So I'm for universal single-payer health care. So I'll let Sam design it, so it'll make sense. I am for a minimum income. I am for a universal some form of pre-K education. I am for vastly increasing the earned income tax credit and vastly increasing Pell Grants, $100 billion infrastructure investment, and a massive increase in investment in all our national labs. To pay for it, I want to abolish all corporate taxes, all personal income taxes, and replace them with a carbon tax, a tax on sugar, and a tax on bullets. Okay? And we can throw in a VAT there, okay?
You may need more than that to close the
that's
number.
fair enough.
Yeah, you may need a little bit.
But the point is, there's two things I'm trying to make, the point I'm trying to make here. In this new environment, we have to get, I think, much more serious about social safety nets. There's a lot of people for whom this world will be too fast. And if you want to know what the revolution looks like, pick up today's paper from people who feel really shafted and left behind. Second, to fund those social safety nets, this to me is where Bernie Sanders falls down, we need to get radically entrepreneurial. We need to unleash these flows. But thirdly, we have got to stop incentivizing bads. Carbon, misallocation of resources, sugar. You know, people didn't notice, the last tax deal that Congress did was $600 billion. It was a tax increase on wealthy people, $600 billion over 10 years, $60 billion a year. Did anyone happen to notice that the first year, the first $60 billion, in the first year, the cleanup for one superstorm, Sandy, you couldn't make this up, was $60 billion. So it ate the entire tax increase. So I think what you've all discussed, what your Growing Global is about a radical shift. And yet we're dealing with a tax structure, a flows structure, Sam, that is out of the New Deal and the Industrial Revolution. And I think this election is the first election. Trump, in his own weird way, has come to a hybrid politics. And I think that's where we're going to have to go. So I want to put that out to you. Would you vote for me?
You go first.
Well, so, Tom, what I'm hearing is a lot about incentives, and that much I strongly agree with. I see in the global economy those countries, those systems that provide the right combination of incentives are going to be the winners. They're
Yeah.
not necessarily the most democratic.
Interesting, yeah, but if they got the incentives right. You move the cheese, you move the mouse. You don't move the cheese, the mouse doesn't move, you know?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You know, we are sitting here in the center of incentive land, New York City, a place where, people aren't religious about economics. They're extremely practical, and they're all incentive driven. You remind me of one very quick story, a meeting I had downtown recently with a private equity fund manager who moves billions of dollars around, and he said, look, son, this isn't that complicated to me. He said, my job when I come in the morning is I've got a certain amount of money. When I exit my office at the end of the day, I need to have more money. If you people...
That's sort of Columbia Business School in one lesson. Y'all can go now. Oh, sorry.
Techno detail there. So he said, if you smart technologists and you people who believe in incentives like the intellectual property system, if you give me the incentives by return on capital to invest in R&D, I'll do it. If you don't, you take the bottom out of those incentive systems, I'm going to go invest in pork bellies.
Yeah, so I might be your running mate if you'd be interested.
I'm looking.
This is getting scary.
One of the things
Remember, I got the money, guys.
I don't know why. It's funny. I've like I said, I've been invited to speak a lot, and as a joke, I've opened many of the speeches with "I'm here tonight to announce my candidacy for the presidency," and I always get applause, and then I say that's a joke, and then I get a lot of groans from the room. So, and they haven't even heard what I have to say. I think my tagline will be "Why the hell not?" Incentives, culture is all about incentives, and I talk about this in the book, and one of the things that I say, for any leader of an enterprise, you have to design a management system that works, and the key to a management system that works is that it aligns the things you want people to do with the ways in which they're rewarded and or punished, right? The consequences make sense. I don't know if I'd agree with 100% of your policies because you want to get that alignment, but what I do agree with is your supernova comment. I was at a conference recently, really good conference, and on the same day, the morning speaker was, one of the speakers in the morning was Tim Cook, and the lunch speaker was Eric Schmidt. And in their comments, they both commented on a phenomenon, and the implications of it, they were diametrically, on the implications, they were diametrically opposed. The phenomenon was universal availability of the internet, right? The universal connectivity for everybody in the country, everybody in the world. Tim Cook said, this will levelize things, this will levelize opportunity, and it will close the income gap. Eric Schmidt said, it will make it worse than you can possibly imagine. And that, I believe that very strongly, right? If you take the same opportunity, particularly as hypercharged as the opportunity that information availability presents, you give it to two people who have very different readiness for it, very different. Some of it's just core aptitude, just the nature of the person. Some of it's how they were raised. Some of it is, you know, things they believe, what they practice, etc. You get two totally different outcomes, and the outcomes are very binary. I was speaking at another university recently, and they asked me to comment on the income gap, right, income inequality. And one of the things I said was, it's much worse than you think. And the reason it's worse than you think is the world is now creating jobs that don't create a slope of income. They create a step function. It's binary, right? And I said, for an example, in my firm, there are a certain set, for an entry-level college job, there are a certain set of skills, abilities, and so forth. We test like crazy. We had 15,000 applications for 12 positions. It is, if you have those, it's a phenomenal job. And if you don't have those, I don't have any other job in the company for you, right? It is literally binary. And that binary nature of employment is growing faster and faster.
Well, just to quickly follow up on that, because there was something that sustained the middle class for 50 years. It was called the high-wage, middle-skilled job. High-wage, middle-skilled. And that's what's evaporated. So, the New York Times ran this piece I was thinking about the other day. It was a couple of years ago about dairy farms in upstate New York that now have gone completely to robotic cow milkers. So no human hand touches these cows. So in the old days, you could be a dairy hand, basically. And now to work in that farm, you have to have been a computer science major. To not be a computer science major, the only job is cleaning the stalls. Because there's nothing now between you and that's really what you're talking about. I want to bring our students in because they wrote these papers, and I'd hate to deny you the chance to ask our panelists a question. And why don't you go first?
Can I just add one point to
Please.
your party? And
Yeah.
very interesting of your party.
Thank you.
Looking for a job too.
Thank you.
One of the things.
Finance manager.
One of the things I've been thinking about, not just middle class,
Yes.
when you think about party, but also like people who live in the poverty. We're talking about 40 million people in this country just
Yes.
living in the poverty. And I volunteer myself to do some financial education for local fairware community.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I see which lack in this country is education for those people. You don't just give them cheaper products. As I'm from China, Confucius said, you give people a fish, they take for a day, but you teach them how to catch the fish, they will beneficial for the life. I think one of the things that I see in this country going future, especially for a large corporate, think about going global, they need to consider those population as well. So that's just one point I'm adding to that. Question-wise, in the chapter, Chris, that you wrote about the government, which is really interesting, that opened my eye, as many governments strive to advance their economic standing and assets, one of the fundamental, challenges for those governments are like changing demographics. I believe that this challenge is also true for businesses, right? Immigrations, the aging distributions, uneven aging distributions really can influence business development. We're talking about the rising of a share of the non-working adults. Definitely can stress business, labor productivities, human capital management. I would say those things are like a trouble probably for organizations who want to go global, not just in next 5 years, I would say in next decade or beyond. My question is around not just about government, not about business, but also about diversity, how you're managing your organizational behaviors, how you manage your diversity culture for those organizations who are thinking about going global, who can, navigate those changes that is coming.
So thank you. It's a great question. And I think there are a number of my colleagues here who can offer up a point of view. Sam's chapter in the book deals with managing innovation and at the intersection of this, but specifically on diversity and demographics. Here's my response. As you're building teams in a corporate environment, and we're going to take for tonight's purposes that you are a global company, whether you are a digital company, which is instantaneously global, or whether you're a hybrid tangible and intangible company, which may be at various stages of being global. As you go about building teams, you're going to naturally under-optimize if you don't extract the wisdom from a diversity of cultures and skill sets. So how do you manage to that, right? You minimize hierarchy, and you maximize merit and insight. So that as you're building a team, you want to pick the people in your organization or within your customer set who's willing to contribute to your decision making, who have high merit and high insight to apply to the question that you're dealing with. And you do not say, well, I'm going to ask Dave to be on the team because he's the senior vice president of X, Y, and Z. Now, Dave might be a good contributor to that, but there's too much management thinking that says, well, we have to think about this in a hierarchy. Whose responsibility is it to control the outcome and all these people who are being selected? So there was a time where Sam would characterize this as basically lowering the center of gravity for decision making, right, and the development. Doug's chapter talks about this. Actually, Shelley's chapter talks about this in a very practical way, which is find the people who understand the local environment best, who can contribute to the evolution and the description of the brand, right? Because if you don't do that, you don't get to that beyond translation universal truth. Shelley's chapter's title is Beyond Translation. It's a powerful title for the subject matter, but it goes right to this question, which is, if you're not taking advantage of the demographic diversity and the combination of insight, experience, and skills that are embedded in that demographic diversity, you're not a very good manager.
Grant.
Thank you, Tom. My question is for any of the panelists who would like to respond. Peter Evans is a co-author who couldn't make it this evening. He wrote a chapter in the book called Networks, Data, and Platforms. In this chapter, he noted that the diffusion of internet and smartphone technologies over the last 20 years has been tremendous. Global internet access has grown now just over 40%, and this growth will continue, especially in emerging markets. Distributed renewable energy can provide clean power to populations that previously had limited to no electricity. And with this comes the promise of the internet with enabled commerce, learning, and many more opportunities. How best can corporations reach these new upcoming internet users who will become customers, contributors to intellectual property, and competitors.
Who would like to take that?
You said intellectual property, so I think Dave has to answer.
Well, thanks, Doug. So,
It's a legal issue, not a legal issue.
yeah, it's I would say it's a human issue, right? So you're talking about the potential of reaching literally billions of people who now have access to innovation, and to the extent it can be leveraged, to the extent it can be made relevant to them, it can be enormously powerful. On the innovation vector of that, what I would say is that the ubiquity of access to computing, therefore to the internet and therefore to the world, has unlocked the possibility of literally hundreds of millions of people becoming innovators. And the way they're reached at that level isn't actually by providing PhDs to everybody, right? But it's by providing the access to the networks of other people who share their issues and their problems, who then team to solve those problems. My view, the greatest gift of the infrastructure and the systems that you're talking about on an innovation vector is that it enables humans to leverage one another, to form communities, to build upon one another. And that's the core concept of innovation, intellectual property in the first place, is standing on higher and higher platforms.
Let me add, I'll take it from I'll call it in Peter's chapter, the platform dimension, then Doug will take it. I think the key is that if you are conceiving today, if you're a company and you're conceiving a product today, that has to be your design point. That wasn't always the case if you were designing any kind of product, whatever it would happen to be. It could be an industrial product, it could be some software application. It doesn't matter what it was. That was not your design point. Your design point was never that when you launch, you're going to be in 100 countries and hit 1 billion people. And that's a whole different design point. And so if you look at things like Uber as an example of a platform design point, they have not had to re-architect that platform. They went from launch to 60 countries in 4 years and 320 cities, whatever it is. I mean, they've not redesigned that. So my only point is, as you look at, I'm involved with these startups today, but when you look at how they design, they design for the supernova and the access points, because volume kills all technologies. They design for that level of interaction and that level of usage. They also, which is interesting now, they're designing for security and privacy within the infrastructure. Day one, they're designing for it. And in the past, the challenge always was, well, how do you make these old systems secure and private? Because they were never designed. The internet never existed. You didn't have all these access points, and therefore, the technology was adequate. But from day one today, that is the consideration. Billions of interactions, 100 countries, lots of languages, totally private and secure. That has to be the design consideration.
So how many people, just picking up on Grant's question, how many people in the room have heard of a company called Quantopian, business called Quantopian? One. I thought I was going to get a clean sweep and actually know something that was on the internet that you guys didn't know. So Quantopian, Quantopian is a business that hits your point right on the head. Quantitative investing or systematic investing, which is not doing traditional equity research, but studying lots of other types of data and then translating that into equity investments. That it's a field that's been around for decades, right? What Quantopian did was based on the premise that, well, you don't have to live in New York City or you don't have to live in London to be capable of doing this. All you have to do is have an appropriate education. So they created a platform where anybody anywhere in the world can plug in, get access to an enormous amount of data, develop algorithms, backtest them on literally thousands of data points of history test the algorithm, and if the algorithm works, they can actually put it forward to the company. The company invests real capital with the algorithm and gives a portion of the profits to the user. Now, Quantopian has been around for a few years, and now, if you look at, we have a special relationship with Quantopian at my firm. If you look at Quantopian's user base, it literally lights up the planet and has created this unique community of people who have a very specific skill and operate at a very high level from around the world in places that you would have, frankly, if somebody had sent me out 5 years ago with several $1 million and said, find me 500 people who are capable of doing this, number one, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And number two, I sure as hell wouldn't have been looking in Africa and Korea and all the places where the Quantopian users exist, right? So it's a perfect example of creating a beacon, using technology to create a beacon, and having the talent run to the beacon.
So Grant, it's estimated that in 2020 there'll be 5.4 million smartphone users in the world. 5.4 billion in 4 years. Okay, billion.
Million in Cleveland.
I'm sorry, billion, 5.4 billion. Exactly. So it used to be that if you wanted to have reach, you had to have physical presence. No longer. And so your question ends up, to Sam's point, being critical to how you are going to design what it is you're choosing to do.
I want to go to the audience, and for those of you who didn't write papers, we're going to give you a chance, and the floor is open. Please, yeah.
Much darker.
Doug, would you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, what do I see for the future of the management consulting industry, and how might it get disrupted? And my answer is, it's much darker since I left the profession.
How many people in the room are going to McKinsey when you graduate?
How many of you are going to McKinsey or some lesser firm? Yeah, great. So first, I think it will definitely change it, but as Sam described earlier, I think these forces that we've been talking about create both threats and opportunities. I think the threats are very real for a certain type of consulting that's been around a long time. There's a type of consulting you might call knowledge consulting, right? It's hire somebody who has some sort of context-specific knowledge, some subject matter expertise, and have them come and, really just kind of do their shtick, right? Play out their expertise for the benefit of your organization. I think that type of consulting is under serious threat. I'll ask another internet question. How many of you have heard of either a site called Wisdeo or Quora?
Oh, look at that.
Okay, more, right? So Wisdeo and Quora are about trying to capture, codify, and catalog all the world's wisdom. Well, that's pretty bold thought. But if you can go after that, you certainly can capture a lot of subject matter expertise and package that in an interactive way, like with Watson, in an interactive way where it's a lot easier to get that. Now, insight is a different animal, right? Insight is a different animal, and application of knowledge is a very different animal too. I think that there's always going to be room to have objective, well-informed, impartial advice on how to apply knowledge to produce insight and to lead you to action. So I think it could be very good for the profession. But back to what we were talking about earlier, the bar is higher, right? Because insight is a heck of a lot harder to produce than knowledge. And understanding the context of a client or an organization well enough to turn the insight into action is harder still.
Please.
I think you should keep it to one side of the room.
Hello, I'm Khalid Azim. I'm with the Columbia Business School. I have a question about culture. I'm also a former U.S. military officer. I was a submarine officer in the Navy, and we had subcultures. no pun intended. Where you had, there was different culture for an aviator versus a surface warrior versus a submariner. There was an army culture, there was a navy culture, but we all had a common culture that was bound to the idea of being American and believing in the Constitution and its values. So in the context of culture, as you define it and describe it, how do you factor in, how do you deal with that texture and the lack of commonality in some cases to what that means to, creating a greater good for our society?
So I'm going to give you a brief answer, and then I want Sam to give you an example because Sam led an organization that had many subcultures that under his lead and powerful ones, and some deep in history, that under his leadership he unified to kind of that higher vision. And why don't I have Sam talk about what he did at IBM, and then I may put something on the end of it translating it back to the country.
Yeah, I mean, basically, we had come to the conclusion that if we were going to prepare the workforce for the future, that we needed to have a different value system. And I do think that we've talked about the political system. It's also true for business. If you're a corporate leader of any, or a business leader, or a leader of any kind, you need to prepare your people for the future. And so we went off, and then the question was, well, if we needed to have a different culture, how do you do it? It wasn't about the need or the words. It's like we said, how do you do it? So the way we did it, and of course people came in and said, well, you should write a book or something, because the founder of IBM wrote the book of Business and Its Beliefs, Tom Watson Sr. I said, well, I don't think it's going to work in 170 countries with 500,000 people and a lot of different religions and cultures. So we decided that we'd let the workforce build the culture of the IBM company. We had a thing we called the Values Jam. And literally, in the early phases, it was predominantly the people that were comfortable in English, but then once we had simultaneous translation, we went from, say, 40 or 50 countries to 100 countries that were participating. But fundamentally, the workforce built the culture. And then what we did after they built the value system, then the next thing we did is we said, is management living up to the value system? And one quick story, and I'll pass it back to Doug. It was a wonderful thing because we had a good year financially and people were feeling very good. So the people wrote in their comments, and so what I did in the staff meeting for effect was I printed out all the comments from the workforce. It was like 6 feet of paper. I mean, they were like 3 or 4 sentences. It wasn't like they were documents, like essays. But, I walked into my staff meeting, I put it on the table, and I said, how you guys feeling? Oh, good year, bonuses are up, usual stuff. Earnings are up, stocks up. I said, let me tell you how the workforce feels. Here, read this. Right? Anyway, that sort of set what we needed to do, and to get the buy-in from all of management that we had to change a lot of the things that we were doing because we weren't reinforcing the value system that the employee base had created.
So you, in a way, you answered your question in your question, but the fact that you feel like there's something missing kind of highlights another part of the chapter. The thing you said was that you had these subcultures, right? No pun. You had these subcultures that were probably all strong and functional within themselves, right? And the unifying theme, which was a very kind of to the essence theme, was the thing that created respect and collaboration, even if groups came from these different subcultures, right? Unfortunately, what happens is that kind of very powerful idea can become dysfunctional very quickly if the leaders, instead of tending to the essence, instead of recognizing the essence. One of the things that Sam and his team distilled out of IBM's Values Jam was a very concise 3-line essence statement. What is IBM all about, right? Regardless of whether you're part of server group or software group or services or in this country or that country, whatever, it got to the essence. But you have to keep tending that. You have to keep coming back to it. Leaders fail the organization when they pit subcultures against each other, right? When they take these interest groups and they start either through blame or envy or whatever, begin to pit them against each other, and they step away from keep drawing everybody up to the real essence. That's when they break down.
And I had one thing, another way, effective way to do it, and I give this young lady here a lot of credit, because in addition to the value system, we needed to come up with something that was what the brand stood for beyond just how we were going to work together, right? And she is the architect with the guy John Awad of a thing called Smarter Planet. And Smarter Planet, the marketing branding of Smarter Planet won 7 of the 8 marketing awards that year, or something. Whatever there were 8. They won 7 of them. But in addition to that, it elevated this idea that we had to integrate teams and come together to create a smarter planet, to solve crime in New York City, to do this thing, save a baby's life. In Toronto, we call it data baby. But all those, the commercial data baby. But anyway, but my point is, if you can connect the value system to the brand and what the brand stands for, you can actually then get, in our case, then 420,000 people to kind of convalesce around it.
You know, just to pick up on a point you made, I used the word collaboration. You know, we often say that, America and Britain are 2 countries divided by a common language, and that's actually true of the United States now. Because in Silicon Valley, if you call someone a collaborator, it's someone you're building something big and great with. In Washington, D.C., if you call someone a collaborator, it's in the Vichy French sense of the term. He's a traitorous person who is cooperating with the other party. And so on both ends of the country, the same word means something fundamentally different. And that is, I think, the essence of why we're in this pickle that we're in. Any other questions? Please, yeah. We'll repeat it. You can. He's got a mic. Yeah.
Hello, I'm a first-year MBA student. So my question is to Sam. So what do you think technology companies should do to address the growing concerns over cybersecurity and privacy when they go global?
Yeah.
And what's your vision of how should government, private company, and all the other parties work together to address the problems of security when any kind of organization go global or selling products globally?
Thanks. Let me just quickly, because this is it's not newsworthy, but I think I should give you a little preamble that I've been appointed by President Obama to be the vice chairman of this thing called the Cybersecurity Commission. So I'll answer it, your question from, first of all, if you were a business today, regardless of the business that you're in, what you should do, and I can get into government too if you like, but that's a little more sensitive. But on the, as a business today, I think it's obvious right now, which it wasn't, say, 5 or 6 years ago, when I used to run around telling all kinds of businesses, wherever they happen to be in the world, that they needed to create their infrastructure that was secure and you could protect the data, the privacy of the data, but do it through an approach not just purely technology, it's process, management, system, and technology. It's all 3 elements because you have to monitor. It's in a way, the analogy is that it's like people that rob banks, right? Now they do it digitally or electronically. In the old days, they went in with guns. So, but fundamentally, they're in there every day with a gun, Billy the Kid's in every day with a gun, right? That's what's happening to your business, wherever it happens to be in the world. And the hackers are very, very sophisticated. So it's a combination of culture, human behavior, management systems, process, do they follow the procedures, and then a really robust technology, 1 to defend, firewalls, et cetera, and 2 to monitor, all those things. And you sit there and you say, well, gosh, I can't afford that as a retailer. I mean, that's going to cost some money. I got to, I buy some systems, I train some people, what have you, and then it happens to Staples and the CEO's fired. Now, maybe he would have a different answer today, right? I mean, if you're the U.S. government, you say, well, gosh, we don't work well together, but, oh, by the way, they got their personnel system hacked, IRS just got hacked, right? They're trying to hack national defense every day. If you are an aerospace company, somebody's trying to get your missile designs in your other kinds of weapon systems, like probably 1 million times a day. So this is what's going on. So the key is, from the commercial perspective, you need to take a very, very rigorous approach. And you can put all these fancy positions in if you want. That's okay. CISOs is what the term is called. But fundamentally, you need to fix your mess if you exist. If you don't exist, then you need to design for this environment. And there really are cloud providers today who have designed for this that they argue, and I tested their premise, and I think it's going to conclude that they're right, that they've designed and they're more secure than your traditional legacy systems, even in the most sophisticated financial systems, you know, and those kinds of things. So I think fundamentally it is very real, and you have to, like anything that's very real, you have to invest to make sure that you're protecting yourself. Now, why does privacy matter from a commercial perspective? Privacy matters from a commercial perspective because if people lose trust in your product, which is now digital, and if it happens, it's immediately all over the world. I mean, if there's a problem with the chicken product in China, everybody knows that Yum brand or Kentucky Fried Chicken, you know, has an issue with the quality of the chicken. They don't care where it came from in the supply chain. They don't care, you know, if the milk is contaminated, it's immediately known through social media, immediately everywhere, right? So it's not just, it's good business, you know, it's not just the right thing to do. The government, quite honestly, and the rest of my colleagues, is not prepared from a legal perspective for this world. I mean, then maybe that will be resolved, and maybe our commission will make some policy recommendations, but they really have not, to your point, the supernovas happened, and they have not been able, all governments of the world, by the way, have not prepared themselves from a legislative perspective on how do you protect individuals' rights of privacy and the information. What is that definition? How do you do it? And the challenge of it is that you cannot, it's like the environment, you know, global warming. You can't solve it one country at a time. You have to solve this thing on a global basis, and you have to get other nations to collaborate, which makes it really hard for any, if you think they can't collaborate within the U.S. political system, throw in Russia and China, you know, just to make it, or then put in Iran too while you're at it, and get some real excitement going, you know, right? So, but that's how you would address the problem. But I don't know if you have a comment on the legal system or public policy, Chris?
Well, the thing I'd add is clearly public policy has to be arranged to be a framework for standards and what is acceptable behavior within those standards and not. And up to this point, governments have commingled this issue. They will talk about national security threats, or they'll talk about law enforcement threats, but not until recently have they talked about industrial commercial threats. And if they were really serious about finding some kind of standards for behavior, multicultural, multilateral standards for behavior, they would break down the problem and say, all right, what are the standards for behavior that are appropriate for commercial enterprise? And are they different than law enforcement? And are they different than national security? Now that dialogue really hasn't happened. Governments have not come to it. But by the way, that's the way they do trade talks, right? They just haven't done it with cybersecurity. So it may be a lag. It might be intentional. The only thing I'll say before I stop is don't assume that all governments want to have a secure environment.
You know what? So one addition from
Why, whatever do you mean?
I can't tell you. I have to kill you.
In my case, they'd execute me and my wife if we told the truth. Since I've signed off, unlike the Secretary of State, I also signed those documents.
So, yeah, from a legal perspective, there's the backdrop that everyone's got to kind of bathe in a way, which is that we are currently experiencing the greatest mass misappropriation of property in the history of mankind, far outstripping everything else that's ever occurred combined, except it's now not mostly physical property, it's mostly intellectual property. And that's what Sam means when he talks about the aerospace industry, the defense industry. Every company that's got anything worth stealing, it is being stolen on a continuous basis that dwarfs anything that's ever happened before. So in my mind, step one is coming to grips with the enormity of the misappropriation and the long-term consequences.
What do you mean by the word misappropriation? I mean,
the stealing,
the theft.
the theft.
Yeah.
A recent estimate I heard is that it has taken over the last 20 years an entire point off the U.S. GDP. So this is
interesting.
Enormous numbers.
That's interesting.
The legal system is just beginning to come to grips with it, with finally the EU and the U.S. Finally putting private right of action laws in place to do
So we've had 1% of our growth literally stolen. It's a powerful thought. We have time for one more question. Right here. Make it good. We'll do two. We'll do the two of you. Yeah.
Hello, I'm the first year MBA student. As some of you have said today that the school not teaching not enough for our rapidly changing world, and some of jobs are replacing by others like AI. Some like AlphaGo just be one of the best Go player in the world. So like I guess I'm curious about what I'm learning here. For example, we are learning some case of Boeing, or some case of something older things. So I think I want to know like what is the most important ability or skills that we can learn during these 2 years, in order to match the fast changing world in the future. And besides that, as the paragraph where the growth goal is say like the China and America face some economic problem, is any geography place that's better for us in the future 5 years? Yeah.
Yeah,
Hold on. I want to get to the last. We'll do the two together.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay,
all right.
this
We're going to run all the way to the back. Don't hurt yourself. Go up those steps.
we're going to combine them into one very
Yeah.
clever question.
You're the only one up here with an MBA, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, look at this.
Thank you. I'm wondering, coming from all of your different perspectives, are you optimistic about the future? And what do you see as the key drivers of that future that you see? How do they play out in the short term, and where might those inflection points in the meantime come?
Go ahead, Sean.
All right, let me start because I come from an industry that people are predicting will be wiped out completely, because anybody can create advertising, right? We've done, we now have user-generated media, and at every Super Bowl, there's the opportunity for Doritos. You write your own commercial, and everyone then goes, well, that's the end of the industry. And what's happened, in fact, is, first of all, here's a little-known fact, is that the people who win these contests, they tend to be unemployed freelance advertising people. So my answer is, I don't think we are ever going to not need people with talent, with creativity, and with judgment. And so if you ask me should you get at a business school, it would be to continue to hone those skills, because at the end of the day, I actually am extremely optimistic about the future. You can do things now that you couldn't dream about when I was a student at Columbia Business School. And you can do it with speed, and the whole world is yours. If you figure it out, the world is yours. And so I couldn't be more optimistic, and one of the reasons I am is because all the things that define human ability will always be needed. I don't care how good Watson is. Someone's got to interpret it.
So I'm also optimistic, because barriers to entry have never been lower, and potential customers have never been greater. Now, the flip side of that is did I miss that? Well, there you go. Yeah, exactly. And no insight. But at the same time as you have more customers than ever before, you also have more competitors. So you do have to have a plan for how you want to take advantage of a very flexible and dynamic, more open world. If you don't have a plan and you wait for it to come to you, it's not going to be a good story. If you do have a plan and you're willing to go get it, even if you fail, you can pivot and try again. So here's the question that is on the minds of the Center for Global Enterprise, and why Sam and all of us decided to put our efforts into this, which is there's a gap in the learning process and the teaching process in traditional institutions. We all learn today faster than institutions teach. And if we can help fill some of those gaps, we can enable you to succeed in this very different world if you have a plan and you're willing to commit to it.
You know, I'd like to pick up on that question if I could. And it's something my teacher and friend, Amory Lovins, the co-founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute, says when people ask him, are you an optimist or a pessimist? This is usually in the environmental context. And Amory says, I'm neither, because they're just two different forms of fatalism. Amory says, I believe in applied hope. I think it's really another way of saying what Chris was saying. I mean, figure out a plan, a goal, and focus on it. But optimism or pessimism are really just two forms of fatalism. It's all going to be okay, or it's all going to be all bad, and neither are true.
I would just add one thing, which is, I think you will probably learn as much from your colleagues, your peers, while you're here, than you are from your faculty. So don't waste it. I mean that in all sincerity. Don't waste it. Don't waste it by thinking, God, if I don't get straight, or honors, I guess, right, high honors at CBS, I'll never get a job at McKinsey. Because I think you're going to learn. You look around this audience. There are people here from all over the world with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different ways of learning, different religious beliefs. I mean, this is the world you will be in. I mean, it's been chosen for you, as Tom said, mostly driven by the supernova. So I sincerely believe that you will learn as much through the interaction of your colleagues as you will in the library, reading some case study or coming up with some new spreadsheet analysis for pricing in finance. At least you'll remember those relationships. I can assure you, you're going to forget everything else if you become a CEO.
Well, Sam, that's, I think, a great place to end it. This has been a terrific panel. I want to thank all our panelists, all the authors here, our questioners, and thank you all for coming.